Hi, everyone. Thanks for having me. And at your meeting tonight, I'm really excited to share my research with you. I've been working on it since about 2014. It's a accumulation of a lot of work and a lot of help. So let's get started. This is going to be like speed dating. I know genealogy can be really boring for the people whose family it is not. So I'll be brief. I just want to say the inspiration behind my work was my father passing away in 2014. He was the closest person on earth to me, and his mother, Etta, and him were just such amazing people. And I just want to say I've introduced you quickly before we move on. So great grandpa Avram Schnitt immigrates from Lithuania to Latvia for a better life, and then in 1905 tests out the waters in America by himself in New York, says the streets are paved with gold, comes back and gets his family, and they all board the SS Umbria in 1906. Then they moved farther west to Los Angeles. You'll see his shop in 1914. He was married to Yetta Schwartz from a large Schwartz family in the Hassenpoth-Asputi region outside of Labau, not too far. And she had the four daughters that she's with. The one on the left is my grandma, Etta, my dearest relative. And then you have Edie, Ann, and Jenny. And of course, in the very forward is Yetta. And then Yetta had five sons. You'll see four here, Joe, Dave, Nathan, and Izzy, but she had a young son pass away as an infant as well. And then in my genealogical search, I found a great uncle that really nobody knew about. He was only in written memoirs as some older drunk fellow who came to high holidays in Labau, but he never even had a name. And I like to bring Liverpool into the mix because I also traveled to Liverpool for my research, and it's just such a vital place when you're doing your ancestry. Everyone came out of there. This family would have come by rickety refugee boat from Latvia to Liverpool, and then of course boarded the SS Umbria. They still went steerage, of course, and it was quite traumatic when they boarded. They were leaving because Joseph there, that handsome fellow in the photograph, he was already playing up. He was quite a Bolshevik, and he was um, printing at home pamphlets and handing them out. He was getting arrested already at 17 years old. When Grandpa went to New York the first time, he knew that he needed to get his family out of there at some point because the Tsar, the last Tsar, had visited in 1903, and it was quite traumatic. Joseph was in the park where I've actually been, and the Cossacks came with swords, and they actually ripped his jacket open before he got home. Yetta, feverishly was always hiding the printing press, trying to keep him safe, from his activities. And then finally they thought, we're just going to leave here because he is going to get us all in trouble. Anyways, what ended up happening is that when they boarded the ship, Yetta had a babe in arms at a few months old. She had an oldest daughter, 19. They all boarded. Joseph, the story goes that he stood there and said, I'm not getting on. I'm fighting for my country and my rights, and that Yetta fainted dead away. That ship sailed without him, and it was very traumatic for the family. Now, he did come later, and he did arrive into America as a stowaway. He had been in a Siberian war camp for a number of years, but he was so sick with tuberculosis when he arrived that he only lived to 27. Other things that I found out, it was fascinating to see the manifest of the ship that they boarded, more proof that you find when you're doing your genealogy. And also, finding out that my grandma Etta, our dearest relative, was a twin. I couldn't even convince my closest relatives when I presented it at our cousins' lunch, our annual cousins' lunch, even though I'd had the birth notes translated from Russian to English, because the children were never told. If we look closely at the manifest, their ages are crossed out. Because to be honest, if you had jaundice, a pink eye, or two children the same age, while if it looked like you were, sneaking someone else's child into America, you could be turned around. So my grandma Etta and my uncle Dave never knew they were twins. They were never told. Another real gem of my genealogy was finding my cousins only in 2019. I found them by leaning more into research around the Holocaust, and I'll get more into that later. But these cousins here, as you can see, they're about our age. It was so fantastic to be able to bring them all of their family tree and all of their family history, because their grandfather, who escaped the Holocaust, he never spoke of it, like a lot of ancestors did not, for obvious reasons. They even went to Latvia 20 years ago as a family with their mother to to find out more about their grandfather Joe, and they came home empty-handed. I'll be able to show you what I presented to them, and my goal for 2022 is to get to Cape Town and meet them in person as soon as this COVID business is over. So I was a travel agent by trade. I worked for Qantas for 20 years. I worked in travel in America. So if I'm always showing maps or talking about the logistics of things, that's probably why. But I'm showing you this map here because it's good to see what the Baltics look like, if you haven't looked before. So Estonia is the smallest state of the Baltics, and you've got Latvia and Lithuania. So Riga is the capital of Latvia. It's the world's only iceless port. And just recently, in the last couple of years before COVID, it's being included on our normal Baltic cruises that are run by all the big cruise ships. So I didn't get into Riga, but I did get on a Baltic cruise in 2017, which left from Copenhagen, and we got to Tallinn in Estonia, 2 nights in St. Petersburg, and Helsinki and Stockholm. I can't recommend a Baltic cruise more if your family or ancestors come from anywhere in Russia. Often, if someone hasn't done their genealogy yet, they'll talk about that their ancestors come from Russia. But once you start to really dive into your research and you can pinpoint where they come from, it gets really real. And I knew by this point in 2017 that I wanted to get to Latvia, so I made sure we did. And when that cruise ended, I actually, with my husband, flew from Copenhagen into Lithuania and across into Latvia. Once I found out I couldn't do it all on my own, even though I had just graduated university and considered myself a bit of a researcher, I got stymied in my genealogical study. So I found Rita online. She actually was on a show like Who Do You Think You Are, where celebrities go and find their ancestors and make it look so simple. When I found Rita, I contacted her and I offered to pay her to work for me. So she worked for 3 months for €250, and she found my genealogy back to the 1700s. I couldn't have done it without her. So with the information that I got through normal channels of researching and websites like Ancestry.com, I put her work in with my work, and I came up with a very good story to share with my cousins in Los Angeles. She's invaluable. One of my friends said, Lisa, you have to get your DNA. And I wasn't afraid to get it. I didn't think they were going to, take over my body by aliens or something. So I had no problem. I went to myheritage.com, but there's a number of ways to do it. They send you a swab. You swab the inside of your cheek and you send it off. It's about $100. And it comes back about 6 weeks later, let's say. Well, when I found that I was 100% Ashkenazi Jew, I had to call Rita in Latvia straight away and tell her. But all she could say was, so, what did you think you were? I mean, she'd already found my heritage back to the 1700s. She thought I was so silly. But I was really excited to consider myself a thoroughbred when all my friends' DNA was coming back with such a variety of ethnicities. One of the things that happens when you do your DNA is they email you. It's something like a party. It has a globe spinning and then a spotlight. And here's my yellow spotlight. And it just hones in on where you're from. And on the left, you can see it says 100% Ashkenazi Jewish. And it pinpoints not only Latvia and Lithuania, but it includes Ukraine, which is where my mother's family is from. So just in hiring yet another expert, didn't cost me anything though, was the travel agency in Labau, or Liepaja, what it's called now, in Latvia. So Agita helped me. I wanted to make sure that I had the best tour guides in regards to, Jewish heritage as possible. I was traveling and studying about the late 1800s up to about 1918 at the latest. I thought that my project was going to be able to skip the Holocaust altogether, and I was pretty happy about that because that's so soul destroying for all of us. But once she started to set up my tours, I found there was no avoiding what had happened in my hometown. As I was saying, we flew from Copenhagen. It took about an hour. We had to land in Lithuania. Taxi picked us up, and we're driving through dense forest, and he still got 4G Wi-Fi in the cab, but everything is so basic there. It was quite unreal. And when we passed into Latvia, it was just amazing. And then we weren't too far from Labau. Labau is 3.5 hours drive from Riga. So I actually didn't get to Riga, much to Rita's chagrin. She couldn't believe that I paid her for all of that research and then didn't come up and see her. But we didn't have time, and I wanted to focus on Labau and the Hasenpoth as Pute region and Guldinga, which is where my family on Yetta's side is from and where Abraham immigrated to from Lithuania. This is how they market Labau today, Liepaja, and the beaches. It's got, hundreds of miles of beautiful coastline. It's got better weather than Russia, and that's why the Tsars made such a presence there and wanted to always be appropriating the Baltic states, and they still do today. This gives you an overview. This trade canal is, where the boats left from to go to Liverpool. There's no documentation on those boats. They probably would have been junket ships, and our ancestors were probably lucky to get to the UK at all. If they were, and they got into the UK before they were able to travel from Liverpool, they would have been held in the Leman Street poor Jewish home, and there is good documentation from them. I don't have it yet, but I know my ancestors, some of them stayed there. So at this point, the Jewish people of Labau are called Labauers or Courlanders. Courlander Jews, their history is hundreds of years old in this region, in the Duchy of Courland. And I got to get to the outskirts. As I was saying, it was very beautiful. I had a fair idea that bad things happened there, and I knew there was a massacre, but like I said, it wasn't my focus at first. This is the hotel we stayed on, and behind us is the convention center made of amber. That's their country stone, and it's one of the many industries they have in the Baltics and in Latvia that our Jewish ancestors were quite involved in. My family itself was not the poorest of the poor. They actually hired Lithuanian refugees, I guess. They'd arrive to the house, and Grandma Yetta would delouse them outside and burn their clothes before putting them to work. When I arrived in Laval, the first tour was this Ziggy, and it was a free walking tour that I'd sourced. And I started to get a real feeling like I was the only Jewish person there when he walked me down the street and he showed me this monument on the left. That's the closest thing to a synagogue they have in Liepaja. The one on the right is the one that the Nazis destroyed, and the one on the left is a small sidewalk statue. The religions there now are, of course, Russian Orthodox and Lutheran. Not to say there's no Jewish people there, but most of them were killed or immigrated to other countries. The next morning, we met in the foyer of the Hotel Labava with two experts. Madra was our English-speaking translator, and Gunners was a professor from the university, and he did not speak any English at all. Their goal was to take me everywhere that's relevant to my own personal story, and they did a wonderful job. The first place they took us was to look at the addresses on my documentation. So I got to go to the houses where my family actually lived. Believe it or not, people still live inside there. The walls are made out of like a paper mache that would come apart in your hand if you touch it. They're from about the 1890s, these structures. Then they took us out to the Jewish Museum, and we got to see this memorial. Behind us is the Jewish portion of the museum. It was quite rack and ruin. It was destroyed by the Nazis. Not a lot of the graves have gravestones anymore, or they're toppled over. But I noticed that some gravestones had brand new, or graves had brand new gravestones on them, done by recent visiting descendants. So I hope to do that as well. They also showed me this wall called the Holocaust Memorial Wall, and I know in the back of my mind that there was a massacre at Ncjw Beach, 20 miles out of Labau. But again, like I said, it wasn't my main focus. So when I was looking at the wall, I was just looking at the SCH for Schwartz and Schnitt and just having a look. Later, I would find out that some of the people that you see here on the right are my relatives. I want to talk to you for a minute about Edward Anders. He was 14 in 1941 when the Nazis came to Latvia. I'm just put below his accolades of where he went to in his life. He's actually still alive. He's around 90. I have communicated with him via email. He's amazing. He wrote about everything that happened at the Ncjw Beach massacre, and he writes and wrote prolifically about the Holocaust. He even was called up to the Nuremberg trials as well. Gunners, our Latvian professor that was taking us around that day, he took us to the Ncjw Beach Holocaust Memorial. And he's actually good friends of Anders. And when you arrive at the memorial, where I didn't know I was going until that day, there's a dedication to Anders, and you pick up a stone and kiss it and, recognize the work that he's done, because if it wouldn't have been for him and his research, this memorial wouldn't have been built. There's also one outside of Riga as well. If you look at it from an aerial view, like the photo on the left, you'll see that it's in a perfect shape of a menorah. And back behind it, there's dense forest. However, it also fronts the Baltic Sea. You can see on the left what the stonework of the menorah looks like. Gunners, Madra, and my husband Alan were discussing the memorial. It was a freezing cold, windy day, and I just was drawn to where the ocean met the sand, right? So I wasn't listening to their whole story. This was all happening at once for me. I walked straight out to the sand there, and I looked around, and the most beautiful stones you've ever seen everywhere, in gold and silver and tan and black and beige. And I just looked out, and from the bottom of my soul came out of my mouth, "Hello, ladies." Now why? I mean, I didn't even know the whole story yet. It was so weird. I looked down, there was a little black stone and the shape of a perfect love heart with just a little inclusion. I wiped it off on my jeans, I kissed it, and I put it in my pocket. And I have it here today to show you. It was fairly daunting at the memorial, but like with all travel and touring, it's always rush, rush, go, go, go. I had to get prepared for the next day when Madra and her friend were taking me out into the countryside or the hinterland of Labau. However, the night after visiting Ncjw Beach Memorial, I was really sick in the night, like the worst migraine you can possibly imagine. And I thought, oh, I'm not going to get to go on that tour tomorrow. I'm really upset. I'm not here for that long. And the next day I woke up perfectly fine. But I told Madra about it, and she said it's happened to so many of her clients who she tours around. It's a physiological um, bad side effect of being on that side of trauma, where in December 1941, almost 3,000 women and children were murdered by the Nazis. So I really felt it. And I was glad to feel well enough to go out the next day because look how beautiful the region is. These are two important photographs. The one on the left is a transport bridge linking the Baltics to Russia. It's one of the oldest bridges in the world, and it was a vital um, bridge for trade and transportation. And then right behind me is the world's widest, shortest waterfall. You can see where the white meets the river, and that's the River Venta, surrounded by really beautiful forests. And because it was the fall, there was some nice fall colors too. Next stop was the Jewish Museum. I did that on my own. It's upstairs in this building and it's quite small. I was happy to get in there and they were very welcoming. They gave me a digital copy of their guidebook. The museum itself is completely dedicated to the Ncjw Beach massacre, like I said, from December 15, 16, and 17, 1941. So all the time that I'd been researching since 2014, I had steered completely clear of the Holocaust because no one in my family ever mentioned it. And they all arrived into America in 1906 and my mom's family in 1922. So they just, not something they ever spoke about. And now here I find that there was a massacre in their hometown, and it's likely that some of their relatives would have been killed there as well, which is exactly what I found out inside. So I'm just going to give you a minute to read this slide. This is some of what I learned in the museum, along with the photographs that they have on display. I'm going to warn you when I'm coming up to a disturbing photograph so you can turn away or close your eyes if you don't want to see it. It's just one slide, but I felt like it was important for me to include it tonight. So this is a blank slide, and the next slide is a photograph of the women at Ncjw Beach in December 1941. What I want to say about this photograph is that you only wish by the time that they were naked in the freezing cold in front of those horrible men that they wanted to die. There's also a photograph in the upper left-hand corner with a child hiding behind those grown women. And there's a sociological debate about why no one is comforting the child. It could be that it's not any of their child and they're really more concerned with the elderly woman in the front. If you look in the lower right-hand corner, that man is called a kicker. And once you're shot, if you don't fall into the pit, then you are kicked down into it. If you remember, I was on the beach at Shedkey Beach, and that's where all those stones were. And I stood right where that, basically on top of that grave, but I just didn't know it yet. Moving on from that, right behind the museum is Alana Ivanova's office. So she's the president of the Jewish Foundation. She's met with people like Henry Kissinger. She works with the US government, all in the hopes to keep the memory of the Holocaust alive is their sole purpose so that it won't happen again. And she is really a wonderful person as well. I hadn't met her yet in person till that day, but we'd been talking online. She was a little too elderly to take me out on tours herself, so that's why I ended up with some other tour guides, but they were great as well. That is her office door on the right, and I put it up because when you step in, you're into an opulent boardroom. The doors are also about, oh gosh, 6 inches thick because it's so cold there. They're huge doors, sometimes double doors, but we went in and we sat down at her boardroom table. And I didn't tell her about the birth certificate from my grandma Etta and that I had asked a Russian-speaking crew member on my Baltic Sea cruise to translate the Russian. I just said to her, "Do you speak Russian?" And they all do. I said, "Can you please read this for me?" And she confirmed that my grandma was a twin and never told. And I just stood up and she gave me a hug like all the world was hugging me. It was just such a poignant, warm, wonderful meeting. She was obviously very busy, but she offered me some more time. And she handed me a book, this book called Latvia's Haunting Secrets by Ethel Davis. I just wanted to bring it to show you guys today also, and said, please write a book of your journey here. It doesn't have to be as elaborate as Ethel Davis's, but please write it. So that's something that I'm beginning to work on this year. The other thing she did was she said, as an afterthought, come into my office for a minute. I quickly got my camera out because she was going pretty fast. But you remember the wall at the Jewish cemetery? So I didn't say their names or ask anything. Just from the research I had forwarded her, she was just confirming my exact relatives who died, including in the lower right-hand corner, 2 of the children, 10 and 12. This really, as I put a special note, really affected Joe Schwartz in Cape Town. He escaped in 1928, and that's his niece and nephew and sister-in-law who were killed at Shedkey Beach. So when I did talk to my new cousins in South Africa, Israel, and London, they said that their grandfather was very taciturn and depressed and kind of an alcoholic, and just wouldn't tell them ever what happened. But he got out, and nobody else in his family did, his immediate family. Also on that day with Alana in her office, very quickly, and I'll finish up, she introduced me to Edward Kaplan, who raced out and picked Alan and I up before we were heading back to Lithuania for our flight back to Copenhagen because they'd found my great uncle Hillel's grave and he wanted to do a death prayer over it. It was incredibly fascinating. It was so sad that it was just a weed-ridden patch. I was actually on my knees before that pulling weeds because it was so traumatizing. And then we had to rush off and fly out. We were actually holidaying in Europe for a couple of months, and I had to just reflect on all I'd learned after I left Latvia, and I wished I could have stayed there longer. One more minute. My dedications, my wonderful father and mother who have both passed away. When my dad passed away in 2014, I threw myself into this genealogy. I don't know where it came from, but I've been relentless with it ever since. I love my boys, David and Peter, and they've been helpful and interested as well. And of course, my husband, Alan, who follows me on around the world and hears all my stories of my family willingly. And thank you all for listening. Feel free to contact me for any further information. And thanks again.